You're all very welcome to Social Justice Ireland's annual conference on the Sustainable Development Goals. On this UN Global Justice Day, today we launched the latest edition of Measuring Progress, the Sustainable Progress Index, our annual report that measures Ireland's progress on implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and compares that development with our European peers at 14 Eurozone member states. Once again, we at Social Justice Ireland are pleased to collaborate with Professor Charles Clarke with the Department of Economics at St. John's University in New York and Dr. Catherine Kavanagh with the Department of Economics at University College Cork in producing this report, both of whom are joining us today to present. We are also pleased to have with us James Kiernan, Director of Relationship Management at Chambers Ireland, an SDG champion. James will outline how the business community in Ireland has been progressing the SDGs. At the end of the webinar, we'll have time for Q&A, so please submit your questions through the Q&A function, and we will address them following the presentations. So first up is Professor Clarke, who will consider the theme of progress and progress traps, in particular casting an eye on inequality and climate change. So Charlie, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me, and greetings from St. John's University in Queens, New York. Queens has produced America's greatest songwriter, Paul Simon, and America's worst politician. And I'll leave that one as it is. I was just thinking when I was driving in that it's 30 years, almost 30 years, next year will be 30 years from when I told Sean about the index for social health that some group had put together in the United States. And he asked if we could do something like that for Ireland. So 96, Catherine and I published the social health index for Ireland. And then in 2015, we were asked to update that. And then we moved on to the Sustainable Progress Index. And in that 30 years or 29 years, there's been an incredible explosion of research and interest in other ways of measuring social progress, well-being, happiness, developing alternatives to what was the one index to rule all index, gross domestic product. So that by now, the limitations of GDP are known and accepted by mainstream economists, international agencies, and in fact, the UN Statistical Commission will be meeting in March, and I expect they're going to finish the new SNA, Systems and National Accounts, 2025, which will replace the 2008 version, and that is the model that countries use for their national income accounting, where GDP comes from, and it's specifically redesigned to account for inequality, sustainability, and many of the issues that GDP leaves out. So we were ahead of the curve, but now we're just at the top of the wave as the demand for all other ways of measuring progress keep on expanding. Okay, so I'm going to start with, let's go to the next slide. That when you ask people about progress, they mostly think about themselves. They think about how are they doing and how are they doing compared to how their parents did and how they feel their children will do. Gallup polled people in multiple countries. Figure 1 has the results for most of the EU 14 countries. And in most cases, people feel that they're doing better than their parents, but they do not think that their children will do as well as they have. The United States, in some ways, is a little ahead of the curve. We now have, not as a matter of opinion, but as a matter of actual measurement, less than 50% of people born in 1980 are doing better than their parents, whereas their parents would have been 85% did better than their parents. So we're now going on a third generation in which well over half of Americans are not doing as good as the generation before. And this is, many political scientists feel that this is one of the major drivers of the rise in right-wing politics, and how politicians will use this and look for groups to blame: immigrants, women, different types of minorities, as if it's their fault and not a change in the structure of the economy, which disadvantaged workers. Okay, next slide. Okay, so if you look at the idea of progress historically, and that by training is in the history of economic thought first, so this is where I always start. There's plenty of discussions of progress if you go back to the ancient Greeks or even St. Augustine, and they have a hint or recognize material progress, but material progress was an effect of moral progress. And sort of you look at St. Augustine's City of Man and City of God, that's sort of the framework for much of the analysis of what would progress be. And it isn't until we get to the 1600s and both the Enlightenment and the rise of capitalism that material progress becomes the main focus. And the main focus is also on the elites achieving material progress, which this is a period we call in economics mercantilism. And it's interesting that many of the themes in mercantilism have come back in the past 10 years or so, besides the tariffs, which everyone is hearing about on a daily basis, but also the idea that elites will make decisions, that government will partner with these elites, and that protections for workers are to be ignored, to be removed or minimized. And we have a quote here from Mandeville, who's certainly one of the more colorful of the mercantilist writers: "The surest wealth consists of a multitude of laborious poors. A great number of them should be ignorant as well as poor." Before this quote, he laments about how unfortunate it is that the Europeans aren't able to bring slaves into their countries to provide cheap labor to exploit. The idea being is that you want to concentrate as much wealth in as few hands as possible. Next slide. Okay, and then in 1750, we get two, at the time, completely unknown and very young people who come out and suggest that there is this idea of universal progress, that the average person's position can be improved. Turgot gives it in one of the public lectures he gives as part of his education, and Adam Smith, in a speech he gave in 1755, we only have some quotes from it. We don't have the whole thing. But he clearly lays out that progress is really progress if it involves the average person. And his book, The Wealth of Nations, is this long assault on mercantilism and the ways that it rigs the economy to help merchants and the sovereigns being the main investors in these mercantilist enterprises. And Smith's limited government attitude is really based on the idea that government is helping the elites. He actually mentions some laws that support workers, and he says, well, if the government's doing anything to support workers, it must be just, because generally they only listen to the business class. But the mercantilists, their big thing was, one of the things is that you had to keep wages low. And Smith actually raises that question in The Wealth of Nations. And he says, we have a quote here: "No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the greater part of its members are poor and miserable." And then he goes on to say that, the standard of progress, material progress, is increasing output and lowering prices so that the people who are actually making everything are also the consumers of it. And so this changes the way economists particularly look at this idea of progress, to shifting it towards output, increase in output to benefit workers and consumers. Next slide. Now, Smith was sort of a bridge with the old world and the new, because he saw that morality was the prerequisite for prosperity, that his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, really is the foundations for the wealth of nations, that we need actors, economic actors, who practice self-control, who do not seek to take advantage of others, but seek exchanges that are mutually beneficial. And that when you have people who have developed like this, then you can give them lots of freedom. You don't have to control them. The market competition will make sure that they don't take advantage of whoever they're interacting with. Progress, he argued, would come when we have more division of labor, which would lead to economic growth. And the argument for free trade is that it allows for the widest expansion of markets, which allows for the widest use of the division of labor. And that's where economic growth comes from. Of course, part of the division of labor is the development of machines and technology. And you have this tradition in economics that John Stuart Mill also picks up, and John Maynard Keynes, that material progress, the market economy, is designed to solve the economic problem, that is, have everyone at a decent standard of living, so that we can devote more of our attention to higher goals in terms of building stronger communities, more attention to the arts, education, other things, instead of everyone having just to work just to survive, that they could have leisure to do other things. Next slide. Now, Adam Smith pointed out that there was a problem with the model that he proposes, which leads to its decline. And that's often overlooked in Smith, that he talks about progress, but there's eventually a decline, and the decline comes from what caused the progress. The division of labor will cause people to specialize in fewer and fewer tasks, so that they become, as he puts it, dull and stupid and incapable of intelligent judgment or conversation, and that the government should do something to fight that. So in what is the engine of progress is a progress trap. Next slide. Okay, so progress trap is a term that's used for something that is key to or critical to progress, and that as that develops, it undermines the very success that it's had. One of the examples that people who write on progress like to use is the overhunting of woolly mammoths. When humans started to hunt woolly mammoths, they got very successful. You kill one, you feed the clan for a couple of weeks. These are massive animals. But they got so good, including driving them off cliffs and killing them in dozens, so that they wiped them out, or they played a significant role in their extinction, because they don't procreate fast enough. And this caused a collapse in many societies, because their numbers had gotten high because they can feed a lot of people. And now not only woolly mammoths, but big game in general gets hunted to near extinction or extinction, because no one thought maybe we should do this in a balanced way. Okay, so we will find that there are three progress traps that we face now. Next slide. So the first one is also one of the things that Adam Smith pointed out, and that is that the use of self-interest and the greed is good as a driver for the economy eventually undercuts the moral foundation that you need in order for people to live together and have strong communities. And so he didn't write this in The Wealth of Nations, but this is in his lectures to his students. He writes, "These are the disadvantages of a commercial spirit. The minds of men are contracted and rendered incapable of elevation. Education is despised, or at least neglected, and the heroic spirit is almost utterly extinguished." So that the economic growth, which is based on first the division of labor and specialization, which leads to undercut it, but also the self-interest and initiative, as that develops, it becomes a barrier. And for Smith, this would lead to eventually a declining society or a stationary state where economic growth will stop because we're no longer innovating. Next slide. And John Stuart Mill takes up on this, and he writes about the stationary state. And other economists at the time also wrote about it, but he was like looking forward to it. He saw the increase in leisure and freedom to do other things for the mass of the population as a huge gain. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes wrote a famous essay, The Economic Possibilities of His Grandchildren, where he argued that in 100 years, we will have completely solved the economic problem. And so we're getting very close to that 100 years, and we have reached the projected gains in output, but we have not reached the decline in labor hours. There's been a decline, but not to the extent that he thought. But he argues in this piece that once we've reached this standard of living, when the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance, he writes, there'll be a great change in the moral codes. And so this idea of the love of money and pursuit of wealth, he says, will start to be looked at as a somewhat disgusting morbidity, one of those semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensities, which one hands over with a shudder to the specialists of mental disease. It's fairly harsh words, but he too also saw that, we want to have a successful economy because it frees people to do other things, not that we need to just keep on grinding people so that the economy is profitable for the few. Next slide. Okay, the second progress trap that we face has to do with the environment and the economy. Our economic success is greatly aided by cheap fossil fuel and the ability, large amounts that we could burn, seemingly thinking there'd be no consequence. And for a good 100, 200 years, they might not have seen the consequences. Now, when you read about people who visited Manchester in the 18 teens and how filthy and dirty it was and how hard it was to breathe, they should have figured out that this is going to be damaging in some extent. But here we have the famous hockey stick graph that shows economic growth from the year one up until fairly recently. And we see that most of the growth has been in the last 100 years or so. And then the other two graphs, which are condensed, they don't have the long time span. If you had the whole long time span, they'd look more like a hockey stick, I guess. Looks at the emissions of different greenhouse gases that are causing the problem with climate change. And the one on the bottom is temperature rise. And, last year was, again, the hottest year on record. And like 7 out of the last 10 were among the hottest years on record. That is certainly happening. The climate is getting warmer. And we probably have already passed what they thought was the degree increase that we needed to avoid major effects. And we are seeing major effects already in many places of the planet. Next slide. Now, and a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, are trying to address this. And so we see emissions in the United States, Japan, Canada, but also in the EU have been going down. But of course, the emissions of the developing world, China, India particularly, are going up way faster than any declines in the West. I think this is going to have to cause us to look at, instead of increasing output as a goal, is just minimizing inputs as a goal and see if we can sustain our way of life with just less inputs. And we could reverse the engineer the market to do that. I think it would send the right signals. Next slide. And of course, the third progress trap is inequality. And again, our growth model is give a lot of money to the rich, hope they invest it, and that's where economic growth comes from. again, now this is a mainstream position that inequality is a barrier to sustainable, not only sustainable development, but economic growth, and that there are large social costs to high inequality that have to be addressed, and that the market is not going to address these. It doesn't, it's not designed for that. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the Beyond GDP movement, which we've talked about at all these meetings, is this idea that we need to look at more than just GDP. And in fact, as I mentioned before, the UN Statistical Commission is developing, hopefully, improvements to national income accounting that will allow us to look at economic progress much more fully, measuring the negative effects as well as the positive effects. Here we have a chart that looks at the richest countries, 1820, then more recently. And we see in the last year, it's oil states and money laundering states that are the 10 richest countries. And that's certainly not good for the planet, for the countries that get rewarded the most to be engaged in those two activities. Okay, next slide. And of course, besides the fundamental flaws of GDP, there is the problem of Ireland's GDP, which when I taught in UCC 1994-95, I went to Dublin for a workshop or a seminar on GDP, and they were talking about how GDP in Ireland is probably 10 to 15% off. And that was before, Apple and all the tax dodge incentives that are built in now have so distorted. So if you look at just GDP per capita, Ireland is number 2 in our group of 14. But if you look at actual household consumption, then it's just below the average of this group, which is, if you lived in Ireland and visited those other places, that's about where you would put it. And on the right, we see how for all but 2 countries, the GDP to individual consumption are very tightly correlated. That's almost you never get a trend line like that in economics. And then you have Ireland and Luxembourg just on a different planet. So this is a problem because Ireland needs to have a measure of aggregate economic activity to make decisions, because a lot of statistics are based on GDP. And without that, Ireland's wages as a share of GDP are like 35%. Well, of course they're not. That's the ridiculous number. But we don't know what the real number is, and we can't really compare it because GDP is so off. Next slide. So in all of the presentations that we've had over the years since 2016, we've also tried to highlight some of these alternative measures of progress. And I've included these 2 graphs that are, I think, versions of it updated in each study. The first one, the scatter diagram, shows that for low-income countries, developing countries, increasing GDP is highly correlated with increasing well-being. But for the rich countries, you see that there's really no meaningful effect between what their GDP per capita is and how well off their citizens are doing. And then in the bottom box, just again, the 3 big ones besides GDP, we have the Social Progress Index, which is where the graph gets its data, the Happiness Index, and the Sustainable Development Goals Index. And for most of them, Ireland's in the middle. The sustainability, we're doing much lower, second to the bottom. But those are, I think, better guides to sort of measuring how Ireland's doing against its comparable countries, which then allows you to ask questions. Well, if other countries are doing better, what can we learn from their practice? Okay, so that's sort of my overview. I think this is my last slide. So I look forward to any questions people have at the end.
Thank you very much, Charlie. So yeah, as Charlie mentioned, at the end of the webinar, we will have time for Q&A. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function and we'll address them following the presentations. So next, we're going to hand over to Dr. Catherine Kavanagh, who will provide an overview of the index itself. Catherine will explain the index and outline where we are making progress and where we're failing to live up to our commitments. The index ranks Ireland in each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, comparing our progress to that of our 14 EU peer countries. So over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, John. And hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today to talk you through the latest version of our Sustainable Progress Index. So first, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of the data and how the index is constructed. And then I'll present the findings and the rankings, first across the three spheres of economy, society, and environment. And then I'll present the overall aggregate index itself. Now, I would urge people to look at the report itself for further detail, particularly in terms of the method and the data and so on. So as everybody knows, I'm assuming here that the UN adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015, and they identified these 17 goals based on 169 targets and over 230 indicators. And of course, the SDGs came into force in 2016. Now, I suppose Eurostat, the World Health Organization, the UN, the CSO and the OECD, they've all committed to monitoring the SDGs and collecting the data that is required by countries to ensure that they do try to achieve progress with the SDGs. And also since around 2016, several researchers, organizations, and even the UN itself have been attempting to report on them. And of course, as Charlie mentioned earlier, social justice, through the work of Charlie, myself and John, have been tracking progress on the SDGs since around that time too. So next slide, please. So then the first thing we did was to examine the latest report from Eurostat, and they produce an annual report, which is very informative. It tracks 5-year trends in the key indicators of the SDGs, although they don't actually produce an index. But the report is actually very valuable because they attempt to track how the EU countries are performing on these indicators. And they also provide conclusions then about how they believe each of the EC 27 countries are performing in the goals. Now, a snapshot of the key findings is provided in this graphic here on this slide. And their assessment is that improvement in the achievement of the goals has occurred, but it has been at different paces for each SDG, from moderate to significant. And you can see here in this graph where this occurs. So on the very top right-hand corner, we see several goals who have achieved, according to Eurostat, significant or strong progress. So we have SDG 8, 10, and 1 are up there on the top right-hand corner. And then moderate progress has been seen on other goals. So, for example, we see, there's been relatively good progress there on 12, 2, 9, and 14 to some extent. And then as we move down towards the left-hand corner, what we see is that there is, much, much less progress. And in fact, it seems to be that there is actually a slight movement away from progress for 2 goals in particular, life on land, number 15, and 3, mainly driven by the impacts of COVID, of course. So next slide, please. And okay, so there's another body of evidence then, and this is the work by Jeffrey Sachs and his colleagues in the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Institute. And their latest report provides a country profile of 193 countries, including many of the less developed countries. And here they do calculate an index, and it's ranked, the index is ranked by how far away a country is from achieving each of the SDGs. So they produce these what are called country-specific dashboards, and based on the data to provide, again, guidelines to policymakers in areas of key challenges. Now, this is their actual slide for Ireland, and the colour codes are important because they identify where progress has been made under SDG. Now, the green indicator suggests that achievement has been made, and then yellow, orange, and red show increasing distance from the SDG. So what we see here in this graph is that for Ireland, the conclusion is that we face major challenges in goals 2, 12, 13, and 17. And then the orange ones are obviously regarded as major challenges, whereas the others are, less challenging perhaps. So we'll move on now to our own report. So next slide. And the first thing I suppose to mention is that we are just focusing on just the EU 14 countries. So we're measuring performance of each country relative to what we consider to be their peers. And these are countries of a similar level of development. And the second thing is that an extensive data set had to be collected in order to construct an index. We draw on two key sources in particular, although there are other sources also. The first is the UN actual global indicator framework for the SDGs, and the second is the EU indicator set. And this one provides, the second EU indicator set provides indicators which are more relevant to EU policies and initiatives. So as far as possible, we try to ensure that the final data set is as closely aligned with the global indicators, but it also then takes account of the EU context. Now, there are a number of other additional rules that we applied in terms of our data selection, such as relevance, applicability. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So we took account of things like relevance and applicability, quality, coverage. We tried to ensure the most recent data set was available, and for many of the indicators, that's 2003. Some are somewhat earlier. That depends on data availability, but we did rule out any data that we consider to be relatively outdated. So drawing on these sort of criteria, we ended up with 86 indicators across the 17 goals to arrive at our final SDG scores. Now, the other thing just to note, and it's worth mentioning, is coverage across the goals is somewhat unequal. However, for most SDGs, we try to ensure we have a minimum of 5 to 6 indicators. And again, this is in line with work done earlier by Sachs and Co., where they say, 6 indicators, would be really required to reflect and mirror the actual goals themselves. And obviously, there are some things because, the data set is 22, 23, that sort of period. Sometimes the impact of more recent events are obviously not captured in the data set here. So we move on now to the next slide, and I just want to say just a few quick words on our method. And again, as I say, it's important if you're interested to draw on the actual report here. Our method is similar to that is used by Jeffrey Sachs and his colleagues in 2016, and indeed since then. The first step is constructing the index is to rescale all the data. That makes it comparable across all indicators, and all the indicators that are expressed in an ascending order then, so that a better performance on an indicator always implies a higher SDG value. And following the UN and Eurostat, equal weight is assigned to each SDG, and all the goals are regarded as equally important and should be indivisible according to the UN. So obviously we know that all of these goals are interconnected and independent. However, we really do think it's useful to look at the 3 different dimensions of economy, society, and environment. So that's what we do next. We take a look at those 3 different themes, and then we will aggregate across all 17 goals to arrive at our Sustainable Progress Index. So if we look at the next slide, so please, what we have here are the economy index results. So let's start here, and what we see is we use 2 goals to construct our economy index. Now, I should say, there is no agreement about what constitutes the economy goals, but we took it to be SDG 8 and 9, which are the ones most relevant, we felt, to the economy. And what we see here is that Ireland is actually ranked joint 7th according to the scores. So SDG 8, as we know, is about decent work and economic growth. It's calculated here by us using 6 indicators. So Ireland does relatively well on SDG 8, and much as you would expect, because it includes things like GDP per capita, employment, the NEAT rate, accidents at work, and so on. So Ireland's score on that is quite high. It's actually second only to Luxembourg. But the overall rank for SDG 8, when we combine all our indicators, is in 4th place. And then when we move on to SDG 9, which is all about resilient and sustainable infrastructure, industrialization, and it also emphasizes research and development and so on. Again, we use 6 indicators. And what's important here, I suppose, is the expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP in Ireland. It's actually the second lowest of our sample of 14 countries at 1.07% in 2023. There are several countries, including Sweden, Finland, Austria, Germany, and Belgium, and so on. These countries are the exceptions. They score highest on that indicator, and they all have expenditure greater than 3% of GDP. Now, the rank on SDG 9 comes out at 10 overall. So that is our economy index. Now we move on to the next slide. And the next slide presents our society index. And our society index is constructed using 8 SDGs to reflect the society dimension. And they are listed over there on the right-hand corner. And the combined score of our SDGs and our country ranking are presented here. And what we see is Ireland is in a relatively healthy sort of 6th position on this dimension. And I think it's kind of worth mentioning as well that in the most recent SACS report, which has just been published recently in 2025, they have an attempt at a society index. They call it the Leave No One Behind index. And again, on that index, Ireland comes in relatively healthy on that dimension in 7th place. So we're not too far off the mark, we feel here. So our relatively favourable position is really driven by very strong performance on the education theme. I'll explain why later. The relatively good performance on peace and justice, which is SDG 16, and good health and well-being, SDG 3. Now, SDG 1 is all about no poverty. Just a few quick words. We do well on the poverty rate, but perhaps less well on other measures of poverty, which are included in that SDG. For SDG 2, which is all about no hunger, this goal is all about achieving at the EU level anyway, healthy diets and ensuring agricultural systems remain productive and sustainable. And at EU level, trends in the area of malnutrition remain quite unfavourable. There's been a significant increase in the share of obese people in the EU since 2014. And indeed, obesity in Ireland is one of the highest among the EU 14 countries. It's just under 20% according to Eurostat. And we rank quite low on SDG 2 as a result. SDG 3 is all about good health and well-being. And within the EU, this SDG had been, characterised by rather strong performance over the last 5 years. And this is also the case for Ireland. Indicators include things like life expectancy, subjective well-being. There's indicators of perception of health, death due to chronic diseases, incidence of smoking, and so on. So Ireland comes in on 3rd place on that SDG 3. Now, the next one is SDG 4, which is all about quality education. Now, education is obviously seen as key in meeting other SDGs. Now, this SDG deals with accessible access to equitable and quality education throughout all stages of life. And our measure here reflects that because we look at indicators from early childhood education through territory and lifelong learning. And this is actually one of the SDGs that Ireland scores very well in. In fact, Ireland's performance on SDG 4 is impressive. We're ranked 1st on this SDG 4. Now, if we move on to SDG 5, which is about gender equality, our goal here consists of 5 indicators, and we have a somewhat mixed performance. We're coming in on 10th place amongst the 14 countries. We're below the EU average on indicators such as the share of women in national parliament, the share of women in senior management roles. There is some positive news. The gender gap is reversed in the area of education, meaning that women are actually ahead of men, and Ireland is ranked 1st actually on that indicator, which is the female education as a percent of male education. Now, obviously, reducing the gender pay gap is one of the key priorities of policies at EU level and indeed at national level. At EU level, the gender pay gap has decreased over the years. Ireland is below the EU 27 average on that measure at 9.3%. A few words about SDG 10, which is all about reduced inequalities. So we use 3 indicators to capture this theme. And Ireland, again, is in a relatively healthy rank according to our data on the basis of comparison to our countries. And we are ranked 5th. Now, I'll come back to SDG 10 in a few moments because I want to say 1 or 2 things about that. SDG 16 is about peace, justice, and strong institutions. And again, the indicators together show that Ireland is a relatively safe society with a low number of deaths associated with homicide or assault, a low perceived occurrence of crime, violence and vandalism. And again, relative to the EU countries on this SDG, we come in at 4th place. And finally, then we come to the last SDG under this theme, and that's SDG 17, which is about partnership for the goals. And of course, we know a strong commitment to global partnership and cooperation is critical for the achievement of Agenda at 2030. A key indicator used in this SDG is the overseas development aid, and Ireland is coming in there at 0.63%. However, when we combine the ODA indicator with other 2 measures, which include indicators of environmental taxes and spend on education and health, Ireland comes in at 10th place. So we'll now move to our 3rd dimension, which is the environment ranking. So this is the kind of the final leg of the stool, and the country scores here are displayed in this table. And what we see is that Ireland is actually coming in somewhat worse than society, and the economy index, it's coming in at 11th place, implying really, I suppose, that there do may remain a lot of challenges in this area to meet our commitment on these goals according to the 2030 agenda. Let me just take you through maybe some of the headline findings. So SDG 6 is all about focusing on sanitation, water quality, water use efficiency. Our analysis suggests that for Ireland, there is still room for improvement on this SDG. Now, there are pluses and minuses on the indicator, but Ireland has scored ranks 10th on this goal. Affordable and clean energy is the focus of SDG 7. So Ireland's CO2 emissions from energy fuels are one of the highest in our sample. The share of renewable energy is one of the lowest relative to our country. And certainly the final energy consumption per capita has fallen, but it is now below the EU average. So Ireland is ranked 10th on that SDG. SDG 11, we do quite well in. This is about the quality of life in our cities and communities. We score well on this. We're in 2nd place. For SDG 12, which is all about consumption and production and about doing better and doing more with less. We use 5 indicators. Despite improvements, and there have been improvements, Ireland continues to generate a significant amount of waste. Recycling of waste is on the lower end of the ranking, and circular material use is ranked low relative to the other countries. The overall score for SDG 12 is 11th place. SDG 13 is all about climate action. We look at one of the key indicators here, which is the GHG gases, because this is what Eurostat use. And again, while there have been some improvements, the overall score when we combine our other indicators is rank of 10. SDG 14 is about the conservation of our oceans. Data availability for SDG 14 is somewhat limited, but we use what we can in this instance, and we're ranked 8th place on SDG 14. And then for life on land, similar to SDG 14, this remains somewhat limited because of data availability. Pluses and minuses are seen here again. For example, the Red List Index, which estimates biodiversity loss, we don't do so well on that. The share of land dedicated to forestry and woodland is quite low relative to the rest of the EU average. So we're ranked in 13th place on the SDG 15. So overall, that gives us a rank of 11 for the environmental index. Now, the next table just shows quickly, so if we move to the next slide, what the overall SDGs look like. So what we can see here is, we can see again that there are certainly some pluses. Ireland is in the top rankings, as we can see there, for SDGs such as number 8, number 3, 4, 11, and 16. We also do relatively well, as I say, on SDG 10, which I mentioned earlier. We're in the middle for about, I suppose, half of the goals, but there are still certainly some challenges ahead, particularly for some of the goals representing the environment. And this, of course, again, is in line with Eurostat and SACS. So now, if we move on to the next slide, I suppose this is just to sum up how much are we really doing overall. And this is where we present our SPI, our Sustainable Progress Index. And this is just a single measure, and it's useful because it provides just a simple report card, I think, to track Ireland's overall performance on the SDGs relative to its peers. And what we see is Ireland is ranked in 9th place overall. And again, the Scandinavian countries, as in previous reports, tend to top the ranking with, again, Spain, Italy, and Greece at the very bottom. I just said, if we can move on to the next slide, I just wanted to share one or two comments about SDG 10, the focus being on inequality. So one of the ways of measuring inequality within countries is to analyse income distribution, and an important indicator under SDG 10 is the proportion of income received by the bottom 40% in terms of income. And what we see here is the EU trend has remained, it's fallen somewhat throughout the 2014 period, but overall it's remained fairly stagnant. We also can see that Ireland's 40% proportion share is slightly above the EU average in 2022 compared to 2017. If that's the little graph down there on the bottom right-hand side, Ireland is towards the left of that graphic, which means that we're above the EU average. If we move to the next slide, we have measures of poverty here, which is, in this instance, the proportion below the 50% median income. This has actually fallen, and by a greater amount than in the EU 14. What we see is that there's little change over the period 2004 to 2001. And this is based on World Bank data, but there's a decline from 9.9% to 6.8% there in Ireland. Slightly different version is used by the EU over here, but we still see similar kind of trends. Another important indicator is the indicator for the labour share, and that's the bottom little diagram there. And again, the UN have noted, and it's an important point, I think, workers' wages have not kept pace with productivity, and labour share of GDP has resumed its long-run decline. And we can see here that for Ireland, the share of labour accounting for GDP has indeed fallen, as it has in the EU, but the extent of the decline is actually greater in Ireland. And of course, a decline in labour share implies that the gains from economic growth are not being shared equally between workers and capital owners. Finally, if we move on to our last slide, which just looks at the impact, I suppose, of fiscal policy, because I suppose, fiscal policy is an important tool in reducing inequality. And again, the figure here just looks at pre and post distribution. And as expected, fiscal policy and distribution has had significant positive effects on income inequality in all of the EU countries. And actually, the effect is very important in Ireland because the Gini falls by over 15 percentage points in the data that we have here. And that is actually it's slightly still just above the EU average, but it has fallen quite significantly. And over here on the very last graph, we have the trends in the Gini index. So again, this is one of the key indicators used in our construction of SDG 10. And what we see again is, one of the key indicators demonstrating why we got that falling score for the SDG 10, where we ended up with a rank of 5 relative to our countries. So I suppose the important thing is, however, that despite positive developments in the past 5 years, the income gap still between the rich and the poor is large in Ireland, as it is in the EU. And my final comment, I suppose, was that, leaving no one behind is crucial for achieving the SDGs. And although the gap has narrowed, we need to continue, I think, to focus on reducing inequalities as a prerequisite for solving many of our interdependent problems. So now enough of all this number stuff. Let's see what really this means on the ground. I'm going to pass you over to John now, who'll talk about some important policy considerations.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So again, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions for Charlie or for Catherine, feel free to put them into the Q&A function. As Catherine said, the particular utility of measuring progress is that, knowing where we stand allows us to make decisions about the actions we're going to take. And our report concludes with a series of policy recommendations intended to support the government to better implement the SDGs. It's now only 5 years until the SDG deadline of 2030. The 2025 programme for government commits to implement a whole of government strategy to fully integrate the SDGs into national policies and initiatives, ensuring that each goal is actively pursued across all levels of government. So, the series of policy recommendations that we offer are intended to support Ireland's implementation of Agenda 2030. So, as we've heard throughout this presentation, the SDGs reorient policy away from blunt economic growth to a more focused approach to environmental and social, as well as economic well-being. In recent years, the government has developed a well-being framework which complements the SDGs. The government's well-being reports, Understanding Life in Ireland, published annually since 2022, assess well-being using a total of 35 indicators. You can change the slide there, please. 35 indicators, and provides a snapshot of progress across 11 dimensions outlined in the well-being framework. Change slide there again, please. So these 11 dimensions of the framework are subjective well-being, mental and physical health, income and wealth, knowledge, skills and innovation, housing and built environment, environment, climate, biodiversity, safety and security, work and job quality, time use, connections, community and participation, and finally, civic engagement, trust and cultural expression. Change slide, please. So the 35 indicators track progress, first of all, over time, over a 5-year period, and second of all, by comparison with the EU average. While equality and sustainability continue to be included in the narrative of the government's report, these critical factors are no longer part of the core progress measurement, and this is disappointing. These are the very pillars essential to ensuring inclusive and resilient well-being. As we stressed in our report, the growth of inequality and the impact of climate change pose serious existential risks, and therefore they need to be closely monitored. Now, major challenges require not just that old approach of aggregate progress as discussed by Professor Clark, but equitable and sustainable solutions. Now, notwithstanding this backward step in the government's well-being framework reports, the development of a multi-dimensional framework to measure well-being remains positive, explicitly linking the SDGs to the 11 dimensions of the well-being framework would also help to mutually reinforce both and support policy coherence as well. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, the SDGs complement the 11 dimensions of the well-being framework. Furthermore, we've been able to map this framework and map the SDGs as well onto Social Justice Ireland's own set of 5 overarching policy outcomes. And we believe that these policy outcomes are necessary for a new social contract. So that's A, a vibrant economy, B, decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability. And all of these need to be met in tandem in order to work. And as you can see from the slide here, we've been able to map the well-being dimensions onto the 5 policy outcomes of Social Justice Ireland's policy framework for a new social contract. So you can see here we have the dimensions of work and job quality, together with knowledge, skills, and innovation, come under the topic of a vibrant economy. The subjective well-being, mental and physical health, housing in the built environment, and community and participation dimensions all sit under the outcome of decent services and infrastructure. The dimension of wealth and income comes under just taxation. Safety and security, together with civic engagement, belong under good governance. And then finally, the environment, climate, and biodiversity, along with time use, comes under sustainability. Now, we believe that government can make significant progress by focusing on the 5 policy outcomes highlighted, and to do so with a sense of mission that recognises that each policy area must be developed in tandem with all others. Now, this approach recognises that all 5 policy areas, all 11 dimensions of the wellbeing framework, and all 17 SDGs form interlocking and mutually supporting systems. As Dr. Kavanagh mentioned, this year we ranked 9th out of 14 in the Sustainable Progress Index, and this leaves us in the bottom half of our 14 EU peer group. So what do we need to do to make progress? Well, our report outlines a series of policy recommendations to support each of the 17 SDGs. And if you go to the next slide there, please. They are divided under the policy outcomes for the new social contract, and then subdivided under the headings of the 11 well-being dimensions. Now, while a full range of policy recommendations is too extensive to go through during this webinar, and I encourage you to download the report and go through each of them, today we'll follow Catherine's lead and focus on SDG 10, reduced inequalities, which you can now see. So beginning with the policy outcome of a vibrant economy, we can see that the well-being dimension of work and job quality is the one that's relevant here. And our policy recommendation is that government recognise the term work is not synonymous with the concept of paid employment. Everybody has a right to work, i.e., to contribute to their own development and to the community and the wider society. This should not be confined to job creation. Work and a job are not the same thing, and both are valuable. Next slide, please. Looking at decent services and infrastructure, we address the well-being dimension of housing and the built environment with the recommendation that government should legislate to require all local authorities to utilise the full allocation of traveller-specific accommodation and to support the development of sites specific for this purpose. Addressing the well-being dimension of connections, community and participation, we recommend, firstly, that government eliminate the barriers faced by people with disabilities in accessing basic services such as housing, healthcare and education. And secondly, the government fully implement the National Traveller and Roma Inclusion Strategy. Going to the next slide, looking at just taxation, we address the well-being dimension of income and wealth. And we recommend that government introduce a minimum effective corporate tax rate of 10%. Now, Social Justice Ireland welcomed and welcomes Ireland's adoption of the 15% rate from last year, from 2024, to apply to all firms with a global annual turnover of 750 million. However, a minimum effective rate of corporate tax should be extended to all firms over the coming years to ensure that everybody pays their fair share. Now, we recommend a headline rate of 17.5% and a minimum effective rate of 10% to be achieved over several years, starting with a minimum rate of 6%. We believe this is a matter of fairness, and we believe that it's possible to do things to maintain a relatively low tax economy to support the economy, while at the same time ensuring that everybody does pay their fair share and that there is justice in our taxation system. Looking at good governance now, we draw attention to the well-being dimensions of safety and security and civic engagement. We recommend that government fully implement the recommendations of the Commission for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination within a reasonable timeframe. We also call on them to fully implement the recommendations of the 2024 Trafficking in Persons Report. And as more and more people move online to digital money services, and particularly for those people who may be unused to using these services, we need to ensure that effective education and fraud prevention measures are there and that they are enhanced. And finally, we also recommend that government ensures adequate funding for civil legal aid. Finally, looking at sustainability, we address the well-being dimension of time use. So we recommend giving greater recognition to the work carried out by carers in Ireland and introduce policy reforms to reduce the financial and emotional pressures on carers. These should focus on addressing the poverty experienced by many carers and their families, and on increasing the provision of respite opportunities for carers and to those for whom they care. We also call on government to request that the CSO conduct an annual survey to discover the value of all unpaid work in the country. So that's the end of our policy recommendations. As I mentioned, there's a full breakdown of the recommendations under each of the SDGs in the report. I'd now like to invite James Kiernan to speak. So James is the Director of Relationship Management at Chambers Ireland, an SDG champion. And James is going to outline how the business community in Ireland have been working to progress the SDGs. So over to you, James.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here with you today. Firstly, I'd like to commend Professor Clark and Dr. Kavanagh and indeed John and Social Justice Ireland on the Progress Index that they've launched today. I've been using it, and we've been using it in Chambers Ireland, both in work and academically, for a number of years. We find this report very useful. It's a great index to see where we are as a society, not just as businesses, but and in our own communities around the country. So well done on the report that's been launched today. I'll just share my screen now. Okay, so first of all, who am I really, and why am I here today, and why do I qualify to talk to you guys? So I'm Director of Relationship Management in Chambers Ireland. So what I look after is I engage with all our chambers around the country. So we have 36 chambers within our network. I engage with government departments on different issues. So we have new government now, and some changes in departments as well. Various stakeholders that we'd have across our network that engage with businesses. These can be national organisations, semi-state bodies, companies of various sizes as well, and all our members within our network. We've 8,000 members. I work a lot on policy and lobbying, so it's really on behalf of our members. So we lobby government and national bodies and regulators on issues that affect business. What we're trying to do is just create a better environment for our businesses to succeed and grow within Ireland. So relationship management comes under my area. I have a team of people that look after this as well. Research and strategic development, and the SDGs and sustainability, last but not least, falls under my remit as well. So there's my background. So I've kind of moved into studying in this area over the last few years. I recently did a dissertation on the SDGs and sustainability and how we can use the SDGs to gain a competitive advantage in what you're doing. I also authored a report on health and well-being in the workplace, and it's an area that we're moving into in Chambers Ireland, and I'll cover that later on. And I sit in the Government Responsible Business Forum along with other forums that I'll go into later on as well. So this is our network of chambers within Ireland. I'll just move you guys out of my way now. So we have 36 chambers within Ireland and one across the border, so 37 in the island, 8,000 members. We have a strong focus on policy, as I said, and we've tried to adopt a leadership role in the area of sustainability to kind of inspire businesses within our network to engage on the topic. We nominate representatives to strategic policy committees. These committees oversee the strategic plans that local authorities would have. They're brand new after being set up after the local elections this year. So they're new committees that we have to nominate people onto. So we have over 100 business representatives around the country on them. But we also nominate representatives to represent businesses on education and training boards in 16 locations around the country. And then local community development committees, which also take place in each local authority and even down into municipal districts within local areas around the country. So it's all about representing the business focus of that we've a business angle, and the business gets a voice on all strategic issues all around the country that affect our members and the people that work in them. So what Chambers Ireland and our chamber network are doing around the SDGs? So why we got involved in the first place is they align with our own goals and strategies. So as we lobby so much on this area, but we see that the SDGs were a perfect framework back in 2015 for engaging businesses on the whole area of sustainability. It's ready-made framework for it. So that's why we jumped on it. It supports business, supports communities. Chambers are very much focused on communities now. We used to be just engaged with businesses, and we probably wouldn't do very much work after, 5:30 on a Friday. But it's all about now. It's about your communities. It's about where your employees live, the green spaces that they're in, the education that their kids avail of, the infrastructure in the area. Just the work-life balance is very important to Chambers now in a way that it wasn't maybe 5 or 6 years ago before we engaged with the SDGs. And we're very engaged in climate action, particularly around targets that we've got coming up, and we're very engaged in diversity. So diversity is something that we've taken very seriously in our network. We have probably 2/3 of employees within the chamber network are female. Probably 3/4 of the either CEOs or presidents of chambers in our network are female and have been for the last 4 years. So it's something that we're very proud of. We're trying to get filtered through that leadership role and that leadership message through to members in our network as well. So these are the 5 business goals that we've originally concentrated on. Now they've evolved a bit over the last year or so, but gender equality, decent work and economic growth, in industry, innovation and infrastructure, sustainable cities and communities, and climate action. These are the SDGs that businesses are most interested in, that they can see that they can actually make action on. So they look at policies in these 5 areas, most of all. We're actually after seeing SDG 3 has creeped in the last year, on the back of some research that we've done as well. So 2 years ago, we did a report on health and well-being in the workplace with the support of Healthy Ireland. It's about the Healthy Workplace Framework that was launched within Ireland to see our businesses engaged on this. We discovered that they weren't very aware of it or engaged on healthy workplace initiatives in their organisation at all. Both physical or mental initiatives weren't engaged at all. So we came up following the research report, 21 recommendations, and we're actually just hiring somebody to implement those recommendations now over the next 3 years within our network. So it's about engaging businesses more on health and well-being, particularly around statistics around mental and physical health that we need to improve. And we can do this through businesses in our network. We feel that businesses are a great place to influence people. You know, you spend probably most time in your work than you do anywhere else, more than even at home, even more than your family. So you spend, up to 8 hours every day working 5 days a week, maybe 6 days a week in your job and in your role. So it's a place where you can be influenced more than anywhere else in your behavior going forward, and you can bring that back home with you and put it into your home actions and your family actions. So what are we doing in here specifically, So we've set up sustainable business councils. So we have a national one that I head up, where we've 10 experts in the area of sustainability from different organizations, large companies, small companies, different industry sectors, that advise us on what's the future trend from sustainability. We also have local sustainable business councils. I'll talk about that later on. But that's just reflecting what we're doing at a national level. At a local level, we felt that there was a bit of a disconnect between what we were doing nationally and what's happening in grassroots around the country. So they're all been set up around the country, 9 locations at the moment, but we want to get to every location in the country. We do local events on sustainability and the SDGs all around our network to build awareness. We have our Sustainable Business Impact Awards, which is going for 22 years now. We highlight and award companies for engaging on the SDGs through these events. We have an SDG toolkit that builds engagement and action. So we launched that over 5 years ago. We're actually in the middle of upgrading this and making this a little bit more modern as well, to engage around modern trends in the area of sustainability that the SDGs, I think, need to engage on, things like reporting. So as we mentioned in the intro, we're an SDG ambassador now. We were a champion, so we're currently an ambassador. So we take that role very seriously. So in this role, we try and get our chambers active in the area of sustainability and the SDGs. We got all our chambers to sign a pledge to support the SDGs. So that's the CEO of Limerick Chamber at the time, who signed a pledge with us. They all signed it to support the SDGs. So they're all active on this space. We also have an awards, which you mentioned, which are very popular. But we use the popularity of this event to publicize the work of the SDGs. We changed from CSR awards a number of years ago to the Sustainable Business Impact Awards. But we look at all these areas that you can actually, businesses can engage to better their communities and better their workplaces and better their environments and award those practices. But they only get specifically awarded them if they engage on the SDGs. We lobby, we feature the SDGs in all our lobbying as well. So any submissions that you see from us, we always feature a piece on the SDGs and how this affects whatever we recommend in our submissions, how it's going to affect an SDG. So it's all about making it relatable. So organizations like Social Justice Ireland can see that there's a bit of an effect been made by a lobbying improvement that we're asking for around the SDGs. We're members of different government forums as well. So I sit on a water stakeholder forum, I sit on an SDG stakeholder forum. We've other representatives in here that sit on energy stakeholder forums and economic ones, human rights stakeholder forums. And I also sit in a rural development forum as well. So all these areas that affect the SDGs and quality of life and improve the country for our citizens, we're all taking part of actively. These forums meet regularly throughout the year, at least 3 to 4 times. So just looking at some of the, what does all this mean? We were active on different submissions. So recently our general election manifesto, we put out 3 manifestos last year, but the general election one was the last one. So these are the things we argue for, so essential infrastructure, which affects, SDG 9. We feel that the infrastructure is a bit lacking. I know, you may have highlighted that we're doing well in it. We feel that we aren't. Some of our physical infrastructure is way behind the European average. Our grid is way behind as well. This doesn't allow renewable energies to come on, which affects SDG 13 as well. So we think about all this in a macro way. Essential infrastructure on water, we're way lacking behind this on this to such a degree that water may become an issue, and access to clean, reliable water might be an issue in a number of years if we don't invest in infrastructure now. Thriving towns and cities. This is something that came in this year because there's a lot of social issues in our towns and cities that have built up over the last maybe 3 to 4 years. That's beginning to manifest itself, and we see this through retail forums that we sit on, and retail members feed this back into us. That towns and cities are just no longer as safe as they used to be. So we need government to invest to make sure that they are being made safer through things like putting more guard on the street, investing in the laws that we have, and just providing more infrastructure and boots on the ground, in this whole area. Just move out of the way again. Just an overall smart green industrial strategy. I'll get into that later on. And just sustainable resilience, really, So we need energy. So at the end of the day, we are a business organization. So, we're not ashamed of the fact that we need to lobby to make sure businesses thrive and grow and our economy is going well, because it's, we often say that it's harder to be green if you're not in the black, So if you're in red, we see that companies that are worried about costs now, and I'll get into it later on, aren't looking at sustainability as much as they used to be, because they're just worried about costs, worried about tariffs, they're worried about retaining staff ahead of sustainability strategies. So Sustainable Business Council, that's who we have. We have 10 experts, industry leaders. We also have chamber executives from our network as well that are on it. They just drive our agenda and are thinking around sustainability and the SDGs. As I said, we set up local Sustainable Business Councils, which are a reflection of what we're doing at a national level, but they go into more granular detail on local issues as well, because we're feeling that, and we've seen this through a lot of forums that we sit on around sustainability and the SDGs, that there's a disconnect. People don't understand what it is, and they don't understand the SDGs and how it can be related to them. So we need to bring this down to a local level. So we have our chambers at local levels in places like Galway and Mallow and Cove and Mullingar and Athlone and Dundalk and everywhere else, setting up local councils with local people that are interested in this at a local level and seeing how they can drive this, engage businesses at that local level on engaging on sustainability and why it's important, particularly now as we get closer and closer and closer to 2030 targets, This is a screenshot of our toolkit, which it's ready available on our website. Our chamber send this out. It's really great for just first steps in engaging on the SDGs. This is used at an academic level as well in courses. So I've lectured on with students on how to use this well, and they use this in projects with certain companies at a local level. But as I say, we're looking at just upgrading it. There's a lot of things we need to we can bring it forward. So we're looking at a 2.0 version of it now. So progress on the goals. So the question really, is sustainability a priority anymore in our members? And we've seen this from two reports that we saw late last year that came in, research out there. It's not a top priority for businesses anymore. Expanding their operations is the focus of businesses now. So maybe back in pre-COVID, sustainability was definitely in the top 3 for organizations, and that included engaging on the SDGs and looking at their staff and how they can improve the lives of their staff and looking at minimum wage and all those things. Now it's not. It's at least 5th in the priorities. So expanding their operations is the focus of businesses now. Other things that are preoccupying them ahead of this area is inflated costs, recruitment and retention. Less than 5% unemployment, but it makes it really hard to recruit and retain people within your network. So just concentrating on that is there's so many vacancies open across our network at the moment that people just can't fill with skilled employees and can't keep them because the smaller companies are losing them to the bigger companies. So it's a constant cycle, and it takes up a lot of time in organizations that don't have a lot of resources. Housing is a big issue. I don't know, I didn't get to see if it's mentioned in your report, but it's definitely something that's a focus of ours. Housing, is huge, and this underpins the economy because, especially in regional Ireland, if organisations are looking at expanding jobs in a certain region, if there's no housing stock available, they look to a different area. They might even look to a different country to make that expansion, especially if they're an FDI. So housing is very important. International trade is coming to focus, especially with the change in politics in the US. So, we're staring down the barrel of tariff wars. So that's an issue, especially because a country like ours, which does a lot of international trade all around the world, it's going to have a knock-on effect. So businesses are looking, do we need to, change our budget around this? Do we need to change our focus? Do we need to hire more people to invest in this area? So that's more of a priority. So these are all further up the agenda, which means sustainability, which we think is hugely important and can have a massive effect on an organization, isn't been taken as seriously. It just isn't. So, as I mentioned, this is one of the reports I was talking about earlier. It's an Ipsos Moro report around sentiment. So we see environmental fatigue is set in big time. 18% less people concerned about the environment than there was the previous year in 2022 compared to 2020, or 2022 compared to 2023. 18% less people consider sustainability when shopping for food. So these are people that work in our members. They used to look at sustainability and where food is sourced. Is it sourced locally? The carbon footprint that's gone into it, they don't look at anymore because of costs and the inflation costs of food, particularly now. So they just kind of look at what's the cheapest version. 6 in 10 businesses consider sustainability not on their radar at all. No increase in the importance of sustainability to customers. So it's about the same. When you ask them, cost savings is the biggest driver of investment in sustainability. So number 2 being customer demand, and number 3, legislation. So that's what's driving sustainability, is a saving around cost. So you see things like SEAI and the grants that are available from them for both domestic and business use. They probably had their best year getting out grants last year, and government, I think, is providing more grants for this, and they'll completely subscribe that out again this year. So it's around costs, but it's those other things after that. So companies are implementing cost savings around electricity and retrofitting their business, but after that they just move on to something else. They don't have a strategy per se around it. Work business is doing. So this is what we're doing. So we sit on all these other forums. So retail forums, we Solace around education, learning and development working group. We have a town task force group that we set up just as around social behaviour and promoting nighttime economies and things like this. We've Enterprise Hub promotion. So the Enterprise Hub was a great initiative set up by government last year, but we're trying to promote that as much as possible rather than reinvent the wheel. We think it's a great support that's there for business. On sustainability, we sit in all these different groups around different things. These are all headed up by various ministers, a lot of junior ministers that are just learning their portfolio in a lot of cases. So these groups we sit on and we interact with and we represent businesses on them. And then there's infrastructure committees with Ishgare and ESB and Gas Networks Ireland that we sit on as well. And our main message in these is about getting renewables onto the grid that help SDG 13. So supports for businesses. So benefits for businesses. So it's good for the brand and reputation. It helps marketing products and services. It attracts and retains staff, and it creates efficiencies that can help the bottom line. So you probably all know this, but these are what we say to businesses: why you need to engage a sustainability strategy, why you need to look at the SDGs and incorporate them into your organization. Barriers that they come back to us on. So they're saying that businesses are saying that we can't because of costs, because we don't have resources, it takes too much time, a lack of expertise, a lack of government support, or a lack of information. One of these 6 things, but costs and resources and time requirement are usually the top 3. Challenges, responsibility managers. So costs, as I said, top of the list. Recruitment issues, time, knowledge of senior management as well as an issue. So priorities for the new government. We have a new government now. It's never been a better time to ask for things. Never been a better time to ask for support. Never been a better time to lobby, we say. So you have a government. This government is going to go to 2030, probably beyond it. So that brings it up to the SDG 2030 targets. So it's a really important government, and they really need to engage on this issue. So we're hammering this with them. We haven't met all ministers yet. We're kind of just at the start of that phase of meeting the new ministers as they get their head around their new portfolios. But the importance of of the SDGs, like we don't want to get to a stage where I think it needs to be brought into big important things like budget day. So you look at things like the budget this year, there was no mention of the SDGs. There never is. I think it was mentioned briefly in an annex of the budget, one mention, and that was it. It needs more support. So these are things that we recommend that we put into our submissions over the last while for the new government. There needs to be a more holistic strategy around smart green industrial strategy, low carbon technologies, enhanced research and innovation, physical initiatives, that you mentioned earlier, skills development. These are all important areas. Thriving towns and cities, public services, social infrastructure investment overall is what we need. We've got a growing population. We need to cater for them. The growing population is probably the biggest pressure point that's putting on, and that you see in gathering information around the progress index is catering for our population, and we don't have the services, and we're at stretching point around it. So having adequate funding needs to be planned in by government over the next number of years. So what's needed really as well, and this is where we see something lacking. So a lot of this is taken care of in government plans, but things that aren't are, awareness of what sustainability really means for businesses, why it's important, why is it important for them to engage on the SDGs? They don't even understand, a lot of businesses, what the SDGs are and how it can be beneficial to their organization and their country, but even their families in that as well. So demonstrate how it can help companies. I think we need support, a marketing campaign or some kind of guide from government around all of this. Like we have an SDG form, but I don't think it's fit for purpose anymore. It needs to be looked at to see what more we can do around the SDG form in the future, that actually engages businesses more. I remember when it was first set up, it used to be great and a lot of businesses used to engage on it, but now it seems to have just lost its direction a little bit. So I think that form can be used a bit better, and it needs more engagement from government as well, rather than lip service. So that's me. I hope I didn't take too long there. I couldn't see where I was time-wise, but I hope I'm okay.
No, you're just about right there, James. Thanks very much.
Okay.
So great. So listen, thank you very much, James. And a lot of food for thought there. Which brings me to the Q&A. So I think we have time for questions. So if anybody has questions, if you haven't been, please pop them into the Q&A now and we'll address them. We have one here, I think maybe for well, either Catherine or Charlie. A different interpretation of Table 15 might be that the failure to increase wages, etc., produces a very high free fiscal Gini, which is then lowered with welfare payments, a growing proportion of which are now once-off payments, which do not persist beyond the first year. Would it not be a better situation if Ireland's pre-fiscal Gini were reduced, e.g. through a fairer distribution of Ireland's growing resources between owners, workers and others? A universal basic income system comes to mind as a better and fairer way to proceed. So I think maybe
Yeah,
Catherine.
I'll come in on that just initially anyway, and I know Charlie will probably want to say something about this, but absolutely 100% agree with that comment. And I mean, you know, the whole point about wages not keeping in line with the particularly GDP per capita growth rate is well made, and indeed the data support that. And what we've seen there is that the labour share has declined, and that does have implications for a whole range of different problems. So I myself would certainly be in support of a basic income. It certainly seems to be, and I know Charlie and I have looked at this before, and we would definitely think it's something that should be definitely considered. And it's a shame that it isn't getting more, I suppose, recognition for an alternative way of you know, distributing what we really need to everybody in a fair way. But I'm sure Charlie might have more to say on the idea of a basic income, but I absolutely agree with that comment. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I don't know if Charlie wanted to comment on that. No, a second question here is coming from John Barimo. Are you looking at a subnational analysis of this report as Irish policy and the UN is calling for more localization of SDGs?
It's something we certainly haven't actually looked at, but absolutely. I mean, we understand that what matters is, you know, how you know, these things get translated very much on the ground, and we do know. And I mean, as James has said, there's an awful lot of work being done locally, but it would be great. But I don't think data would necessarily permit us at the moment to look upon the actual 16 goals and all the indicators. So the data collection would be quite extreme. But certainly I'm assuming from a policy perspective, like there's so much being done already, and it would be great if we could even, you know, garner a lot of that information together to see what exactly is going on the ground. What do you think, Charlie? There's Charlie there now.
Yeah, I somehow got timed out or something.
Yeah.
There is a more regional reporting that is starting, and I think Ireland is broken into 3 areas now. Like the Eurostat has this new system, yeah, it's particularly because the realities of, you know, rural Ireland are just so completely different from Dublin. In fact, everyone's different than Dublin, and it's almost, you could treat them as if they're different countries. And their funding and everything is much, it's not like the United States where the states are independent to a certain extent. So yeah, no, I haven't seen anyone like do a deep dive into that. Getting back to the first question, basically Ireland culturally is an Anglo-American social welfare state. I had a whole section on culture that I took out because I realized I was getting carried away. And so used to have high inequality, used to be, you know, second worst to the United States in terms of Gini coefficient, if you look at the 80s and 90s. Since they've joined the Eurozone, they've moved and they fit much more closer to the continental than they do the Anglo-American. They're way lower inequality. And it's because of the redistribution through fiscal policy. And I think it would be a good idea, besides looking at the whole a basic income as a way to redress it, but also just looking at how other countries start off with lower inequality. And a lot of that is giving workers more bargaining and giving small businesses a better chance to compete so that the wealth isn't so concentrated. And I think in the long run, that is something worth pursuing, making the overall economy itself fair, get rid of the unfair advantages that are put in there. And then you don't have to do as much redistribution on the other end. And that's basically what the Scandinavians have done to a certain extent. Although some of them do that and then they have massive redistribution after it as well. But it seems that there's a chance that Ireland will start to have a backlash against helping people that the United States is having, and then everyone gets thrown just to the market. And the market isn't neutral. The market has been constructed to produce the results that it produces, and they can be different, as other countries have different distributions of income through their markets. The wages that we pay out aren't, this is the wage that's necessary to get this price signal so that people do X, Y, and Z that we teach in our principles classes. There's a lot of factors that go in and that are malleable to change the results a bit.
Another question here from Councillor Poonam Rane. Sustainability is becoming an increasingly important factor for business, not only in meeting regulatory requirements, but also in enhancing long-term resilience and competitiveness. What initiatives or resources does Chambers Ireland have or plan to develop to help businesses better understand what sustainability truly means in practice and how they can leverage sustainable practices for economic and operational benefits? So James, I don't know if you can talk about maybe some of the things that Chambers Ireland has in the pipeline.
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, as I said, we're upgrading our toolkit. So our toolkit actually looks at ways that you can actually just make money around it. So we work with organizations like I mentioned SEAI in my presentation that provide grant aid for businesses to engage on things like retrofitting their warehouse space, their office space around sustainability. But we also have green strategies for our own chambers and for businesses as well, that they can actually just look at holistically their organization. They can bring in things like the climate toolkit calculator, which government has, which is really good, that looks at the inputs, what you put into your organization, you know, water flow in, water flow out, waste in, waste out, the expenses that you have on a weekly and monthly basis on energy. And it actually allows you to look at a strategy around engaging on this to actually improve yourself year on year, so that, you know, you're looking at things that you're recycling more, that your consumption is going down, that food waste in your organization is going down, which we have a huge problem with in Ireland, and that your energy consumption is managed in an effective way. Like it doesn't look at macro things like where the energy originally comes from and it's generated from, whether it's renewable or not. That's more a government side of things, but actually just looks at, you know, how we can build strategies around it in your organization. So we do have supports around that. What we're trying to do now is just build our toolkit up to engage things like reporting. So we've got legislation that's coming and worries companies around things like CSRD. There's not an awful lot of companies that are in the scope of it or will be in the scope of it very soon within Ireland, but still it affects the value chain and the supply chain of all companies. So if you want to win contracts from larger companies in future, you have to demonstrate your green credentials. If you want to get funding from things like banks in the future to expand your organization, you're going to have to demonstrate green credentials to get that funding. You see more and more annual reports of larger companies talk about smaller companies within their supply chain that allow them to engage, you know, in their ESG and helps their ESG reporting. So we're building our toolkit to look at reporting and how reporting affects companies of different sectors and different sizes. You know, like ESG isn't for everybody. B Corp is, you know, another great initiative, but it's not for all organizations either. It depends on what organization you are. So we're going to make recommendations around that in our version 2.0 of our SDG toolkit. I can't hear you there, John, sorry.
Sorry about that. Thanks very much, James. Another question that's relevant, I think, for Catherine and Charlie as the authors report, but also yourself, James, is the very low rate of investment in R&D seems to be in stark contrast with the fact that much of our economy is high tech and pharma and IT. How do we explain this? Oh, Catherine, you're muted there.
Yeah, it's a good point. And really, I don't have the answer to the question, I suppose, but certainly this is something that we've seen, not just in this report, but in many of the reports over the last few years that we've conducted. This indicator, the percent spend on R&D is low and continues to be low. And as I say, some of the other countries are, at that 3% level, and it's just striking that Ireland hasn't kept pace with it, So I don't know. I mean, well, obviously it is a percent of GNP or GDP as well. So perhaps that has something to do with it. But still, it's not the only, I would imagine, factor that's driving that indicator. But it is a bit concerning that it has, been at the lower end of the ranking for the last several years now in a row.
Yeah, I'm surprised the government has their modified GDP.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
which I still think is way off the base. But they don't use it to then recalculate all these percent of GDP statistics. And again, it's hard to make good policy decisions if you don't have good information. And so, this could easily be that Ireland is comparable to its competitors, but we don't know. And
Absolutely.
you'd have to get the raw data and then pick an alternative, like an alternative statistic where Ireland is accurate, like on my graph where I have the household expenditures, but something that you then can actually do a benchmarking exercise, because that's effectively what we're doing. And the whole point is we have countries that we're comparing ourselves against because they are comparable. And so what they achieve in most cases is something that Ireland could move towards, because, it's not like comparing with the United States and China. These are not comparable on any measure, just based on sheer size. But so that, it would be so much more helpful for any policy discussion to have much more accurate data.
Yeah, if I could come in on that, Charlie, I think you're right. I mean, certainly the GDP. I mean, a lot of the measures that we've used in our report have come from Eurostat, and the indicator is, R&D as a percentage of GDP. It might be worth looking at, maybe, just to see what that percentage as a measure of GNI might be or something. And I suspect you would see obviously a difference. But yeah, it's something we could look into and maybe just present the two measures to see how different they look. But yes, as a percentage of GDP, it has continued to be low over the last few years. So it is something well worth looking into.
And I think actually your answer there has touched upon another question that's come in, which is the fact that Ireland is a major outlier on GDP against domestic consumption. Have you any suggestions for a replacement of GDP? How does the measure GNI star fare? Which I think you've already kind of addressed there, Charlie. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, no, I still think that is, like I said, when I was living in Cork in 94, 95, I went to a conference in Dublin on GDP versus GNP. And I forgot, it was one of the senior guys who was at UCD at the time. And I'm not going to say any names because I might get it wrong. But he was one of the senior economists in Ireland at the time. And he says, yeah, I think it's probably off by 11%. Well, 11% is a lot, and that was before you had 4 American companies come here and place their patent office or lease their airplanes or various other things that they do. in order to avoid paying taxes in other countries. And so I was at I was at the United Nations. We brought some students there, and I was talking to one of the economists there who went to the same graduate program that I did, and he was talking about fiscal space in Ireland, and he had a lot of interesting insights. And then I realized, but it could all be completely off because, again, the UN, he's getting data on GDP and how high it is, and look at what the government spends. It's so low, and so yeah, again, it's just it makes it very hard to do evidence-based policy analysis if the evidence is so. It's like if your blood sugar level was 3 times what it should be, but you don't have diabetes. It's like your doctor would always be off, and you'd be on the wrong medicine, and so it would. Yeah, someone's got to try to figure out how to hack around it, so that they can then start calculating the percent of GDP type statistics in a way that it's comparable. Because it's not that you have to do it for Ireland, then you have to match it up with all the other countries.
Yeah. I think we have time for a final question there, and there's one here that actually maybe is directed at yourself, James. You talk about the barriers to sustainability for business. What do you suggest that government can do to reduce these barriers?
Okay. I suppose that the main barrier is costs. So reducing costs for businesses is a major thing. It's something we lobby hard on. So you're looking at big costs for businesses around important measures, though, that they need to be coming in, that they've been putting off for a number of years. Things like increasing the minimum wage up to the living wage, which we need to do. Pension auto enrollment as well, because we have an aging economy. These are necessary measures that previous governments have probably put off. So I don't think we can actually cut them out. I think they're important. But other costs for business as well, particularly around energy. We've recently had a storm in Ireland. That there's talk about it's going to cost the normal bill payer a lot of money to actually invest in our network to make it more robust for future storms. But is this something that the government can actually take on board? So it's not actually looking at adding to the bills of customers, adding to the bills of businesses to reinforce the network across the country. We've grossly underinvested in our infrastructure around our grid infrastructure, our water infrastructure, and our road infrastructure that we need to catch up on. So, like Ireland, while we're actually posting surpluses in our annual budgets, just look at kind of investing in this quickly. But a lot of this stuff happens slowly as well, and even like streamlining the planning system to make it happen a little bit faster. We need to invest in our services that were provided as well through jobs as well, to make sure we have sufficient engineers to build out and all this. But this goes back to education as well. Is our education system providing enough engineers to support the infrastructure build that we need to do around the economy in the future? So it's a lot more macro when you get into it in detail like that. But I think costs is a thing that business, like we always lobby hard on, and trying to keep costs down for businesses is very important. So I think that's the main thing that government can do. A lot of things that government can't affect, but it can affect things like that.
Okay, thanks very much, James. Well, look, we'll wrap up. We're just on time. So look, I want to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Charles Clarke and Dr. Catherine Kavanagh for their tremendous work once again this year on the Sustainable Progress Index, as well as presenting at the launch today. I also wish to thank James Kiernan of Chambers Ireland for joining us today to give the perspective of the business community on efforts to support the SDGs. So, and thank you all for tuning in as well, and for joining us this afternoon. So have a good day.